Hello, everyone. Got some exciting stuff to talk about today, and I don't say that lightly because it's a Wednesday, so it must be really exciting. Actually, it's the same things we've been doing the past few Wednesdays. It's going to be NetSuite and homework. Although, quick note on the schedule, we are doing our last NetSuite walkthrough today. Next Wednesday is going to be the entire class period devoted to NetSuite. You have an assignment to do in NetSuite that's going to require some of your skills from the last four lessons to work through. I'll be here to kind of provide you some guidance if you get something, but should for the most part be straightforward. Then homework for next week is not due until Friday. Okay, homework is going to be reviewed on Friday. We're going to do our last Excel activity, then homework. Then week 13, we're gonna have our last chapter, then we're gonna have our exam review, and then week 14, our exam. Things are wrapping up. Are you excited or are you just really sad because no more AIS? Very sad. Okay. I appreciate that. Speaking of people who are very sad about AIS, I was just legitimately curious. I've never done this before, but I decided to do it just for irony's sake. I was curious what people named some of their products on NetSuite because my assumption was most people did not put I love AIS textbook. And you know what? I was wrong. I would say the vast majority of people did that. I'm not sure if that's because everybody loves AIS or just like, I'm going to follow Dr. Barnes' instructions to the letter. Either way, cool. All right. But I wanted to share some of the ones that are not AI or I love AIS textbooks. Some of the ones I thought were kind of cool. Some of them are pretty blah, to be frank. I did have a smattering of people who put like AIS or AIS textbook and just kind of like, you know what? I'm going to follow what Dr. Barnes says, but I don't love AIS. I'm just going to put it as a textbook on there. I had one student that specifically said, I love AIS, but in parentheses before love says don't. Okay. I don't love AIS textbook. I had some people that decided to go with their own unique products. So I had pizza boxes, cupcake stands, coffee mugs, personalized schedules, and USA flags. Okay, USA flags. I think the USA flag when the description said red, white, and blue, baby. And the person who did that, all I'm going to say is you missed an opportunity. You should have gone back and put the image back into the document, you know, with the flag. So I would have permitted it that then. That would have been perfectly appropriate. One that I really loved is it's not I love AIS, but I love my girlfriend. The memoirs of a very happy boyfriend. Isn't that beautiful? And everybody's like saying, I wish I'd thought of that now. You know, it's like the significant other. And then probably my favorite was US nuclear codes. So yeah. So apparently somebody is selling US nuclear codes on NetSuite. So yeah. I have to say, there is precedent for this. The first time I learned about NetSuite, which was actually the previous AIS instructor, walked the faculty through some of the things that we were doing. So I did have some exposure to this. Remember that whole thing where we bought a vehicle back at the very beginning activity? We walked through that activity and we were supposed to buy a truck. I bought a Batmobile. Okay, so that's what I thought. So there is some room for extrapolation here and some room for expansion, but most everybody was happy with I Love AIS textbooks, the memoirs of a Truman State business student. And I would have to say, if you do become one of those people that wants to reflect upon your time at Truman, I hope that you use that title. Okay, I hope that you use the I Love AIS, and it doesn't have to be a textbook; it can just be I Love AIS. All right. Today we are going to wrap up the revenue process section on NetSuite. There's going to be a lot of pointing and clicking today. There's not a lot of inputs. It is an important section to walk through all the processes. You will want to still take diligent notes because I will ask questions on what the process steps are, but not a lot of inputs. We've already done all of our inputs. So just as a refresher, we did some things in the last class session that I want to review. Not so much the forms, although the forms are going to get a little confusing as we move forward here because some of them default to the preferred settings and some of them do not. I can't explain that. But one of the things I want to reflect upon, remember we created our forms last week, and then I said, let's go ahead and let's go back to, hold on, I'm going to make sure that I bring up my document. I didn't bring my iPad with me, so I'm a little bit behind on where I need to be. It's the problem. You forget one thing and all of a sudden you're falling behind. Talk amongst yourselves. What was your favorite name for a product in NetSuite? American flag. Yeah, okay. We'll have some good patriotism. Yeah, yeah. All right, my apologies. So we talked really quickly. We had to go through this the setup and the custom or some items in oh my gosh. This This is brutal. It's jumping from schedule to schedule here. Okay, hold on a second. Somebody watching this is going to say, like, this guy has no idea what he's doing. And you're not wrong. You're not wrong. But I'm trying to make sure I give you the right guidance here. And then my phone closes on me because I forgot my iPad. Don't forget your iPad when you do stuff like this. That's the best advice I can give you. Okay. So remember that we jumped over to accounting preferences. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We jumped over to accounting preferences, and we looked at this before for purchases, but we did it so for revenues. And remember, we had to actually look at that. Let's just go ahead and go to that real quick so we can reflect upon it because it was really, really important. So set up accounting preferences. And we did that. We went to order management. And like I said, we did this back for purchasing. We had to go and check and make sure that bill in advance received was not checked. That was just to make sure that our vendors are not sending us invoices before received. But then we also had to check and make sure that this was pending approval instead of pending fulfillment. What was our logic behind that? The identification is that anytime that a sales order is entered, there should be a separate step in the process to make sure that it also gets approved. What do we call that concept when there's a separation between the entry of a transaction or the recording of a transaction and the approval of that transaction? What is that a element of? Segregation of duties. Okay, so that's an application of this particular concept. Then we went through the process of entering an order. We actually had a sales order. Now, hopefully you wrote this down because this is going to become very relevant here in just a second. But remember when we were entering the sales order, we were doing this based on a document provided by our client, which I did not provide to you. I just basically made up the information. But they would send us a purchase order, their internal document that we derive our sales order from. And that information should match what is on the sales order is on the purchase order. So whenever they create that purchase order, they send that to us. We derive our sales order. That sales order is then sent in and it was approved. That's where we're at right now. We've got an approved sales order. So let's go back to the home screen. And you should have sales order, probably sales order 169, unless you had to enter multiple ones. If you did, that's fine. It's not a big deal. But let's go ahead and let's walk through the rest of the steps of the process so that we can finally get some orders sent out and paid for. So click on sales order. Now, if you did the approval process the way that you're supposed to, you went through the approval step. Now, you may say, Dr. Barnes, that was a required step. I said, yeah, it was. But remember, your submission was just the sales order. It was not an approved sales order. It was just the sales order itself. And then we walked through the approval step after I actually had you create that document. So hopefully you've gone through the approval step, and that approval step, making sure checking there were no overdue balances and there were no overdue. Should say pending fulfillment up here on the screen. Is everybody in this state right here on pending fulfillment? Because if it says pending approval, then you have to go through and approve the steps. And I'm not going to wait for you while you're doing that because we've already done that. So let's go ahead and fulfill the order. What does fulfillment mean in this context? What does fulfillment mean? That means where we're going to send the goods out to our customer. That's where we're going to ship the goods out to our customer. Normally, there would be less of a gap than 1 week between approval and sending the goods out. But we're going to ignore that and say that we're just now getting around to fulfillment. So let's go ahead and click on fulfill. Does anybody spell fulfill without the L just naturally? Like whenever they use the word fulfill, like that's always tripped me up that there's a full fill is what it's saying there. Really, really weird. That's the English language, everybody. No rules, just things that we make up off the top of our heads. Like how do we spell through? Thruff. T-H-R-O-U-G-H. T-H and then rough. Sorry, I'm waiting for NetSuite, so I'm making stuff up as I go along. All right, item fulfillment. Now, this is actually a much more complicated process than I might think. We're not going to go through a lot of entry. Like I said, it's going to be kind of a point and click step, but we do need to know what's happening here with respect to this process. So let's think about what happens when we're going through order fulfillment in a warehouse. So you're in the warehouse. Again, this is a different individual from the person who recorded the order and the person who approved the order. We're not talking about somebody who's in the warehouse. What function would that be, by the way, if we're talking about somebody in the warehouse? They're surrounded by inventory, which is an asset. So it's probably, well, we've already talked about authorization recording. So it's probably custody. Yeah, custody of assets. Okay. So these are the people who have custody of assets, and this is going to be part of that step. All right. So we see the order. We got all these items, all these inventory items that are on racks in the warehouse. We've got to go ahead and pick those items out. So you'll notice that the status is listed here as picked. Okay. Which is our first step. making sure we pick up those items and put them aside so we can send them out to the customers. Then, do we just have to pull the items off the shelves and say we're done? Presumably, we've got to ship them to the customers, and usually they come into a fancy box. I know everything I've ordered for Amazon comes in a nice cardboard box. I've got a big box of cardboard boxes in my living room right now because of all the Amazon stuff I've ordered. I'm not even joking. It's huge. Okay. So we've got to pack it, and then eventually we've got to ship it. So we've got 3 steps: picking, packing, shipping, which we've got to go through all 3 of those steps. The nice thing is that this does not it's not involved process, but we have to make sure that all of our details are correct. So let's go ahead and check and make sure our customer's correct. We want to make sure our date is correct. We do need to make sure specifically that we're on picked, okay? So this should auto-populate. Again, if you're seeing something else, then something went wrong and you're going to have to back up and redo the process. But I don't think that should be a problem. For fulfillment, we're making sure we fulfilled the order that we entered last week, which was sending out this product. For somebody, it's US nuclear codes. For me, it's I Love AIS textbook. We're going to send 5 sets of nuclear codes out to somebody. All right. They're getting a discount on there too if they charge $14.99 for those nuclear codes. I got to imagine that they just go for a lot more on the market, or $29.99. Sorry, double that price. Let's go ahead and check on shipping real quick. We're just going to verify some information. So remember, we set up UPS shipping and we actually verified the address and we got a shipping cost of $10. So all that should be correct. And if all that's correct, we're going to click on save. Now, really important. Make sure you click on save, just blank straight up save. Do not go to save and bill. If you go to save and bill, we're going to skip our next processes, which is not really a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but you will miss the opportunity to see what we have to do for packing and shipping. So go ahead and click on save. And then while we wait, the next step is moving towards past where we're going to be, past the picking step. So this is where we say we have picked up everything off of the shelves and we have set it aside. The next step is to put it in a box because we got to ship it out to the customer. So that's where we're going to go to the packing step. And presumably, if we do everything correct, yep, the status says picked. And now we've got to go to the step we're going to pack. Now, this is a lot less difficult. We just need to validate information. Again, we're trying to make sure that everything that we shipped out is correct, that was created from the proper sales order. We do have a transaction order, which is the item fulfillment number 131. That was created automatically by the system itself. We're just checking to make sure everything's correct. We can go check on shipping and make sure the shipping address is correct. But the actual steps here are really, really one-sided or just very, very simple. We're going to mark as packed, okay? Now, again, this is going to be taking place in the warehouse, and I do want to note here, the same person can go through the process of picking, packing, and shipping the merchandise. This is not a separation of the process because these are all custody functions. So even though there are 3 steps here, it can actually be done by the same individual. So let's mark as packed. Once it's in a box, what do we got to do? We got to ship it out to the customer. We got to ship it out to the customer. So now we should have status marked as packed. Again, we can validate the information, but we've pretty much on hand, we pretty much know that the information is going to be correct because we've checked it multiple times. So let's go ahead and mark this. Oops, come on, go there. Let's mark this as shipped. All right. Logically speaking, we have finished our side of the process. Now, what would happen back if we go to the BPMN diagrams back from the revenue process? Remember all that back in chapter 7 when we did this? So what is it? Why is this event important with respect to these activities that will recognize the BPMN diagram? There was one thing that was really, really explicit that I told you you needed to remember back in chapter 7. And I know you're like, Dr. Barnes, that's way past us. That was last exam. We're focused on the new exam. We're focused on internal controls. We're focused on emerging technologies. That's great, but we still need to reflect a little bit about what we talked about. So at this point right here, we have shipped it out to the customers. What does that mean from an accounting perspective? That's right. So we can recognize we recognize the revenue. We can start to move towards billing the customers. We have met our performance obligation for the recognition of revenue. So this is where we get to book that journal entry saying, all right, we've got an accounts receivable debit. We've got a credit for sales because we have met our obligation. And as was pointed out, now we can actually bill the customer. We have the right to do that because we have met our obligation to provide the goods. So what's predictably, we're probably going to go to bill. So let's go ahead and click on bill. Now, if we do this correctly, if we're going to bill, what's the name of the document that we use for billing? What is that called? Starts with the letter I. Invoice. Yes, we're going to go to the invoice. Okay. So you will notice something immediately off. There's something immediately off on this screen that should not occur, and I can't explain why it doesn't occur. It's easy to fix, but if we move forward without fixing this problem, there's going to be issues. There's going to be trouble right here in Kirksville City. What is the problem in this particular document?
Primary.
Yeah, look at the form. We created a default form for primary invoice form, and it defaulted to invoice. This is not the form that we want. So let's go ahead and go to primary invoice form. Now, why is it bringing up invoice instead of primary invoice form? The answer is I don't know. I've tried to fix this through multiple iterations and it will not fix, okay? We know that this is the preferred form. We checked it. This is why it's always important to check and make sure that your information is accurate. This is just kind of a happy circumstance that this comes into play because I get to show you if we don't check and make sure everything's correct, there can be errors that pop up. So now we're on primary invoice form. It should have changed the layout for the form a little bit because remember we're using a different form. Let's go ahead and check our data. Invoice form is going to be automatically generated, which is great. We want the system to generate that automatically for us. Our date is accurate. Our customer is accurate. Remember our purchase order was A367. And we can go down and we can check and make sure all these are correct. Now, how many people have heard of a three-way match or a four-way match from previous courses? Anybody heard those terms before? Let's go ahead and talk about this concept because this is a really important concept for accounting perspective. We didn't talk about it in the purchasing process, which we probably should have, but that's fine, okay? We can talk about it now. The reason that we have such an extensive document trail within these systems is that we want to make sure we have redundant information. And if all that information is correct, we have basically redundant information that tells us, leads us to a conclusion. So I'm going to go and I'm going to pull up my purchase order here. I'm also going to pull up my sales order and I'm going to match this to the invoice that's generated through NetSuite. Why am I doing that? It's for purposes of matching information. I want to make sure that I'm sending to the correct customer, that it's going to the correct address, okay? Shipping, which oddly is not coming up here, but I was really, really confident I could click on shipping address. Boy, that's just really embarrassing, isn't it? But the most important thing is we're checking, make sure that we're sending out the right goods at the right price and that we have the right information. So we're basically matching all this information. When we match the purchase order, the ship or sales order, and the invoice, we call that a three-way match. A three-way match because there are three documents that we're making sure all the information is consistent between those. Now, is it possible to do more than a three-way match? Could we actually match multiple documents beyond that? Could I include additional documents here? Like if I had a purchase request or if I had a shipping document, could I actually match those as well? Yes. It could go to a three-way match, possibly even a four-way match, possibly even a five-way match, depending on how extensive we want to be. For purposes of simplicity, let's go ahead and stick with a three-way match. And our three-way match in this process is going to be purchase order, sales order, invoice. And if all the information is consistent across those three documents, that tells us everything should be good. Everything should be good. We're ready to ship out. So let's go ahead and make sure all of our information is consistent. Again, making sure that we're on the primary invoice form, making sure that we have all the information, the details. The due date up here is going to be 11/28/2025. So this is 30 days from today. That's specifically saying that this is when your bill is due. This is when you actually have to make the payment on that. So that was the terms of 1% 10 net 30. That's the net balance due. But if they pay within 10 days, we're going to give them a discount, which by the way, they're going to pay within like 10 minutes. Okay. So we're going to give them that discount, but we'll get to that here in just a second. All right. Checking all this. We're really good. So let's go ahead and just click on save. And this is basically where we issue the invoice to the customer. NetSuite's going to send them that invoice electronically, and they're going to know, all right, something we have to pay within 30 days, maybe even 10 days, or even 10 minutes, depending on the situation. Now, if you're following along on Brightspace, you may notice that we've reached a point of documentation that we have to have for today's assignment. There is actually two documents that you need to submit for today's assignment. The first of these is going to be your invoice. So let's go over here. Do not click on accept payment yet because we're not there yet. So hover, highlight the printer icon and click on print. For most everyone, I think everyone actually, this will come as a blank document. For one person, this should be a USA flag, but no judgment, no judgment. We actually got our information in detail up here, and we need to save this and put this on Brightspace. Now, again, I know I've said this multiple times and everybody should do this by default by now, but do we save the document as it is? No. We print it out, save that as a PDF, and upload the PDF file. Actually threw me for a loop. Some people were saving it as just the original name, which is nlsprintform.nl, and I started to get upset. I was like saying, why did they upload it in a file? And actually they just named it that file, but uploaded a PDF. So you're good. I'm not no longer angry. Angry for a second, but then my anger was misplaced. It's the best kind of anger is when the anger just goes immediately away. But that's just one document. That's just one document. We got more documents to come. So, yes.
Say the three-way match was.
The 3-0 match we're doing here is purchase order, sales order, and invoice. And there can be any number of combination of documents we can do for matching, but that's what we're doing for this process. Making sure that all of this doc information is consistent, which it is, which why we can issue the invoice. So our customer receives the invoice and they say, this looks good. We received those 5 textbooks or 5 nuclear codes or 5 whatever it is they're going to be receiving. They're going to make payment on that. Okay. So once they make payment, we're going to accept payment. So let's go ahead and click on the accept payment button. All right, so now we're at the payment system. Now remember, we did not have to walk through this process when we did this in the purchasing process. We did actually print out the check that we issued, but the payment we issued automatically when we went through the process itself. Now accepting the payment is a little bit more nuanced because we're receiving this from the customer. So we do have a separate payment number, which again, don't confuse this with a customer check number. This is an internal documented check or item. And we need to check and make sure all of our details correct. So you will notice here, very interesting enough, this is not going to the same account that we had for our purchases. Remember when we did purchasing, or we were in the purchasing process, when we issued that cash disbursement, it came out of account number 1020, which was also a cash account. And I talked a little bit about that. I said, why is it important that we specify that account versus 1010? And the answer is that oftentimes in a separation of responsibilities environment such as this, we have different accounts for different types of transactions. The cash receipts will go to one account and the cash payments will come from a different account to try to make sure that we organize those. So if you see cash disbursements coming out of this account, it's a signal something is wrong. So that's why we have something like that set up. So we're all set up on our locations, our subsidiary. Let's make sure that our account's correct. So we got accounts receivable for customers. This is really important to specify this right here, because remember, accounts receivable is a large account in the financial statements, but it's made up of a whole bunch of small accounts that are at the subsidiary or customer level. So we want to specify that this is where it should go. Also, you will notice that we do not have to change our form because it did default to a primary customer payment form. That was one of the nice things, so we don't have to make an adjustment there. We do need to make sure the application is correct. Fortunately, there's only one transaction we have to worry about, and it's got to be automatically applied down here. If it's not, make sure you click on that apply button because we won't have anything to apply otherwise. And you will notice that we've got a discount of $1.50. It's $158.45. So they did pay within 10 days. Like I said, paid within 10 minutes. So they are eligible for that 1% discount that we offered them. Checking all that information to make sure it's correct, you probably can figure out where we're moving here. We're doing our last click on our last save button. So let's go ahead and do that. And this is officially the point where we save the customer payment. However, there is a special form for customer payment. And that is going to be the last form that you have to submit for the walkthrough submissions. Now, it's not the last NetSuite form because you do have multiple documents you have to submit next week. But let's go ahead and do a printout of that. So head over the print button, go to print. As everything before, you're going to check and make sure all the information is correct. And you're going to save this as a PDF file and upload this to your Brightspace submission link. And once you've done that, congratulations, you finished all of the NetSuite walkthroughs for this course. So you should feel like now that you can go and be an administrator for NetSuite for a big organization and can not have any worries whatsoever. You should not feel like that, okay? Everybody should feel like we got some introduction to NetSuite, but there's still a lot left to learn. The good news is we've got a reinforcement activity that we're going to be doing next week, which will kind of test your knowledge of some of these fundamental things that we've talked about over the past 4 sessions. So hopefully you took diligent notes, and if you didn't, then you'll learn something that you've forgotten or reinforce something you've forgotten. But yeah, go ahead and upload those to Brightspace, and then we're done. Not with class, but with this particular item. The next step is to walk through the homework, which was due today. Hopefully you didn't find the homework assignments too hard. I think these are good reinforcement activities, but I tried to keep the stuff pretty basic. I do want to reiterate, this is really, really important. And it doesn't matter how many times I say this in this course, I've historically had at least a few students that have not taken this seriously. This is a really important chapter in my consideration, and the stuff that I said is absolutely going to be on the exam, will absolutely be on the exam. There were a couple of example multiple choice questions. Hopefully you paid really close attention to those, because those are types of questions I might ask. When I get to those points and I say, this is absolutely going to be on the exam, please make sure that you're taking it seriously and you're learning the material in depth, okay? So one of the things that's likely not to be on the exam, but still good to know, is which section of Sarbanes-Oxley is about assessing internal controls. So anybody remember that from the lecture? 404. Does anybody know what a 404 error is, by the way, on a computer? It's like when you can't find a file or find a particular site. I always thought that funny that they actually named the Sarbanes-Oxley section 404. That's the section that sometimes I would not like to be able to find because it's kind of rigorous and intense. But it's section 404, SOX 404. Question number 3. Controls that are designed to prevent, detect, or correct errors in transactions that are processed through the specific subsystem are referred to as what? Okay, so this is an interesting question. So we could talk about them as general controls. Remember, general are going to be access controls. Now, specifically, we talk about access controls. What do access controls relate to, or what entity do access controls relate to? What party? Employees, okay? Employees, or more generally, we can talk about stakeholders, but usually employees. This seems to be a specific system series of controls. So we're not talking about access or general controls. We're probably talking about application controls because of the use of the word subsystem, something in system. Now, we haven't talked about anything about processing controls, so hopefully you can ignore that answer. So the only thing that makes sense in this context is going to be B, application controls, because that's going to be related to the system. Now, it says both prevent and to correct and detect errors. What did I say on Monday with respect to system or application controls? They are primarily what in nature? Are they preventative or detective and corrective? They're primarily detective and corrective, okay? Not entirely, okay? We do have some preventive controls in system control or in application controls, but for the most part, we try to restrict our preventive controls to access or general controls, and then our detective and corrective controls are going to be the application controls. Now, again, that's not a perfect alignment. You will definitely find preventive controls that exist in application controls, but it's an easy way to think about those, and I do like the easy way to think about things. All right, here's a first question of things that will definitely be on the exam. Questions like this. Which of the following is not a component of the COSO 2013 internal control framework? How many people in the room have memorized all 5 components already and are feeling very comfortable about listing those off? Well, fortunately, I've been teaching this for a long time, so I'm very comfortable about it. At the very top, we're talking about the environment of the organization and what their approach to control is. That's called control environment. That is, in my opinion, the most important component of internal controls. Next is basically where you identify what the risk the entity is subject to, entity's risk assessment. Then we say, we have risks, we've got to implement controls, we implement control activities. Once the control activities are implemented, we have to confer responsibility or convey responsibility to the appropriate parties. That's information and communication. Then finally, we know that risks change over time. Is that a true statement? Hopefully you identify that risks change over time, because I did talk about that. Risks do change over time, so we've got to update controls as necessary. That is called monitoring, okay? By the way, those 5 things that I just walked through in the detail I provided, you should be able to do that by the time the exam comes around. You should be able to list off all 5 and be able to provide rote definitions for them. If you're not able to do that, you're going to have a bad time, all right? So which of those was not listed out of the ones that I listed? So control activities, was that one of them? That was number 3. Risk assessment. That was number 2. Control environment. That was the first one. Monitoring is the 5th one. Effective operations sounds good, but it is not one of the COSO components. All right. Question number 6. A field check is what? So this is an interesting one. This is an example of an application control, but what is a field check trying to do? It's basically saying, okay, within this field, it has to be either a specific input or it can only go within a certain range. So it's restricting the type of data or the number of the information that can be put within a certain field. What does that sound like to you? Does that sound like it's trying to detect if something's wrong or if it's trying to prevent incorrect information from being input in the first place? Sure sounds like a preventive control to me, okay? It's restricting information that can be put into the detail. So it can actually, it prevents bad data from being input into a particular field. So field check is a preventive control. Oh, this is an interesting one. I don't generally like true false questions, but I'm going to talk about this one. What about backup? Is it a preventive control? It's an interesting question. Okay, is backup a preventive control? We're actually going to have a very distinct answer for this a little bit later on, but let's just think about it naturally. So what was our example of backup we talked about? Remember, we talked about the Truman State system. The Truman State system fell down as a result of a ransomware attack a couple of years ago. So what happened then? They actually used their backup to restore the Truman State system. So did the backup prevent the attack from ever occurring? So it's not a preventive control. It is a corrective control, a corrective control. So you have to detect a problem and then fix it. So the answer is false. It is not a preventive control. Question number 12. Based on COSO 2013, which of the following statements are not correct? All right, let's go through them. Employees at any level of the organization play a role in internal control. Remember that cube that I showed you? And I said there were 3 sides to the cube, and then the one that was on the right-hand side, we didn't talk a lot about it, but I did talk briefly about it. And I said that controls can operate at different levels in the organization: entity level, function level, unit level, things like that. What does that tell us? That tells us that controls can operate at any level of organization and that any employee could be subject to controls. That's true. Has anybody ever had a part-time job? Were you subject to internal controls in your part-time job? We didn't call it that, Dr. Barnes, but I guess, yes, I was. Yes, you absolutely were. The rules and restrictions that applied to your position were absolutely internal controls. So A is correct. Internal controls can provide reasonable assurance only. This is an interesting one. This sure sounds like it's incorrect because you say, that's an absolute statement, Dr. Barnes, and I don't dig absolute statements. But what is this trying to convey? It's trying to say reasonable assurance versus absolute assurance. Now, I don't want to go into a lot of detail about this, but do internal controls guarantee that bad things won't happen? No, okay? They provide reasonable assurance that bad things won't happen. That's basically what it's trying to say there. So B is a correct statement. Internal control is a process consisting of ongoing tasks and activities. What do you guys think? That sounds reasonable to me, doesn't it? Safe. It sounds like he's trying to do a trap. I'm not. It's actually a reasonable statement. C is a correct statement. So then we have the responsibility of monitoring the effectiveness of internal controls belongs to the internal audit group. So some of you met with some internal auditors a few days ago. Is that their responsibility? They have responsibility for testing internal controls, but who has responsibility for the design, implementation, and maintenance of internal controls? That's management, okay? That's management. According to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, management has responsibility for making sure that those are all accurate and correct. So the monitoring of the effectiveness of internal controls, that's something we talked about. Sarbanes-Oxley Act, that's management. So that's why that's an incorrect statement. So D is our answer. Look at this. We have another question about the 5 components of internal controls. Do you want me to go through them again? Probably not. Again, really, really important. One of the things I like to ask about. Which one of these is not listed? Control environment, is that it listed? Yes. Control assessment, is that listed? No, it's not. Control assessment, again, sounds good, but it's not. It's risk assessment. So B is our answer. Control activities and monitoring activities, both listed. Okay. Access control ensure and authorized personnel have access to, only authorized personnel have access to a firm network is what? So think about access control. You all are subject to an access control while walking into this classroom. You sit down at the computer and you pull stuff up, but before you do that, you have to do what? You have to put your name and your password. And that's not just to assert that they pull up the information that's unique to you, but also to make sure that you're authorized to do that. In other words, it's preventing you from getting access to areas that you don't have access to. Like you say, I'm going to pull up Dr. Barnes' grade book and see how everybody else is doing. Does anybody have access to that grade book? This is a trick question. If somebody raises their hand, I'm going to go start throwing things. So yeah. Nobody has access to the grade book, so you don't have full access. It prevents access to things, areas that you shouldn't have access to. So this is a preventive control. It's an example of a preventive control. And sorry, I said a preventive control, but more specifically, we're talking about access controls. It's going to be a general control. It's going to be an example of center control. All right, talking about those IT governance frameworks we talked about. So we talked about three of them. We talked about COBIT, ITIL, and ISO 27000. And starting with ISO 27000, ISO 27000 had to do with a specific topic area, specifically IT security. Okay, IT security, or if we want to get more technical, it developed something called an ISMS. What does ISMS stand for? Information Security Management System. So if we're talking about information security management, that sounds like a good analogy. So it's ISO 27000 series. By the way, we're going to talk about COBIT in just a second. What does ITIL represent? What is it? What does the framework cover? So it has to do with IT service offerings, IT service, what services IT can provide to the organization. Segregation of duty is a what? So segregation of duty is that CAR, custody authorization recording, that's actually separating out responsibilities. What is the purpose of that? We've talked about that a little bit earlier in NetSuite. We said the same person who entered the sales order is not the same person who authorized it, is not the same person who's actually responsible for the warehouse aggregation of the shipment. So those three responsibilities have to be separated out. What is that trying to do? Trying to prevent somebody from doing something they should not be allowed to do. If we had somebody who has the ability to record the transaction and authorize transaction, those salespeople are going to go nuts. It's like, okay, I'm making $1 million sales so I can get a 10% commission and retire. Wouldn't that be great? Actually, a 10% commission is pretty high. If you find a 10% commission, you probably should take that job. Actually, never mind. It's probably a shady offering. Never mind. Ignore my advice. Ignore my advice. All right. So we're talking about that. What we're trying to do is trying to prevent bad things from happening. A segregation duties is a preventive control. Question number 19. Which of the following is a correct statement about the COBIT 2019 framework? I told you that we were going to talk about this again. So COBIT was one of the big ones. That was one of the more broad ones, okay? It had to do with the operations of internal information technology and more about the governance of systems. So if we're talking about it as a general statement, it's going to be designed for information and technology governance and management. A subset of that could be IT service offerings and IT security. So ITIL and ISO 27000 series could both fall under COBIT. The COBIT is intentionally broad. It's more of a scaled question. We talk about COBIT. Those can both, it's a governance framework, but it can be used jointly with the other types as well. But IT governance and management is what you need to know for the exam. That's what we're going to be focusing on with COBIT. All right, moving on. Discussion questions. So use a few sentences to describe IT general controls and application controls and give examples of these two controls. So general controls, we've talked about them in this course already. They're access controls. And I don't need to really reiterate of these, but the idea being is that access controls restrict who can access the systems within or areas within a system. At a very basic level, we've talked about your access controls to the computers in this classroom. More appropriately would be access within NetSuite. And one of the things that I harped on when we were going through the NetSuite applications is saying different individuals would be responsible for different tasks within a process area. In the purchasing process, we had different individuals who were responsible for making the purchase, who were authorizing the purchase, and then receiving the purchase, as well as making payments and recording those transactions. So different responsibility areas, multiple different areas of responsibility. The whole goal being is that we're trying to prevent bad things from happening, prevent improper ordering from taking place. Now, the other one's going to be application controls. And broadly speaking, application controls are trying to make sure that a system can track information and identify if there's problems. Now, we definitely have preventive controls within system controls or application controls. The example of field check that we talked about earlier is an example of an application control that's preventive. But largely speaking, if we're trying to identify problems within a system, that's going to be a detective control with the purpose of correcting eventually. So that's going to be how we we separate out those concepts. Access or general controls are largely preventative. That we restrict the access that individuals can have within a system. Usually those individuals are employees, not always, but usually. And then application controls are basically tracking the information and the pathways that people do within the system so we can identify if there's problems and fix them as necessary. All right, question number 7. Segregation of duties is an important internal controls. What functions must be separated? Hopefully you were able to answer this without going back to this because this is something we've talked about all throughout the semester. But again, CAR, custody of assets, authorization of transactions, recording of transactions. At this point, you should be saying all of these. You should be saying all those words together. You could just say custody authorization of recording, but I really want to know, what is it that you have custody of? Assets. What is it you're authorizing? Transactions. What is your recording? Transactions. There should be a separation between those particular tasks within a process area. Okay. And then it says, so what if ideal segregation duties is not economically feasible? What are some compensating controls that would reduce the risk of errors or fraud? So let's talk about this because this is an interesting question. In a large organization, we would expect segregation duties to be in place. So remember our example from earlier today? I said that we have a different person that's issuing or receiving the sales order and recording it. That person is different from the person approving the sales order, who's different from the person aggregating the goods for shipment. Those were an example of custody authorization recording. Custody for the shipping function, authorization for the approval function, and recording for the receipt of the sales order. So those are going to be 3 steps that presumably would be held by 3 different individuals. That's true for many large organizations. Is every organization on the planet large? No. What if we have a small organization? A really good example of this might be a charitable organization. How many people do you think are in the finance operation of most charities? It's like they have 30 people in the finance operations. Like, okay, we've got 30 accountants here. We're well set. What is the goal of a charity? What should be the goal of a charity? To maximize the charitable donations and minimize the administrative overhead. Can we say that? Would you donate to a charity where they said, okay, your contribution of $100, $80 of that goes to help paying for the charity's operations and 20 of that goes to actual charitable cause? Kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? So a charitable organization, by definition, wants to have minimal administration. What is the problem with that? If it's minimal administration, there's probably not enough individuals working there to have proper segregation of duties. By the way, how frequently do you think fraud occurs at charitable organizations? Once in a while? Happens all the friggin' time, okay? Charities are rampant with fraud for the reason that I just talked about. Minimal administration, so somebody gets in and says, you know what? I kind of feel like I might need to. I'm going to take a little bit of this charity's offering. And they do like $5, then $30, and then eventually it's $100,000. And then nobody's watching it because there's no oversight. So if you're in that scenario, let's say that you are on the board of directors of the Kirksville United Way, and they've got one person responsible for financial reporting for that organization. Are you going to be a little bit nervous? It's like, no, Dr. Barnes, I am not listening to what you're saying. I don't care about custody authorization recording. Shame on you. Shame on you. Everybody should care about this, okay? So segregation duty should be very, very important, all right? It does not exist in this organization. You should be very nervous and say, what can I do, Dr. Barnes? I really want to know because I really am on the board of the Kirksville United Way. The answer is there should be remedial oversight. The people who are responsible for the governance of the organization, which would be like the board of directors, should check the work of the administrators. There should be some sort of review of their processes to make sure that nothing's out of line. So you're going through the process, you're going through the books, and you're seeing transactions that say $100,000 cash flow to a bank account that you don't recognize. You may say, that's weird. I should probably ask the administrator of this account why $100,000 went to something other than our charity. And they may say, oh, that was to a separate branch of the charity. Oh, can you show me the paperwork? Can you look at the bank account? It's bank account of the administrator's personal administrator's bank account. Frauds don't actually occur that simply, but just for context, that's how you'd identify it. Reviewing the process is basically how we would administer if we had a lack of segregation of duties. And this occurs quite a bit in really, really small organizations where we cannot have proper segregation of duties. It's really important to note that you should be aware that separation of responsibilities does not exist, and there does need to be a review of that process. Okay, so that's basically the answer to this question. It's making sure that somebody actually takes responsibility for reviewing the work of the person who's in that area. Last question. 3 types of controls: preventive, detective, corrective. List some examples of each type. We've already talked about that at length today. Okay. So explain which of these types of control auditors would focus on evaluating a company's effectiveness of internal controls and why. So this is a trick question, isn't it? So by the way that this worded, it says, well, one of these is more important than the other. How many people believe that? Now, in a perfect world, would preventive controls be proper? Actually, in a perfect world, controls wouldn't be necessary because mistakes would never happen. Nobody would ever try to commit fraud. There would never be any issues. Okay, so that's a bad scenario. But okay, If we can make preventive controls 100% effective, would we need detective or corrective controls? No. The whole purpose of detective corrective controls is to correct issues or fix issues after they happen. If preventive controls were fully effective, then we wouldn't have any issues. But the simple truth is preventive controls are necessary because we want to prevent problems from happening, but so are detective and corrective controls because the mistakes will happen. Issues will occur. So we need to be able to fix those problems. So what's the answer to this question? The answer is all of the above. All right. If you answered all of the above, that's a correct answer, by the way. Correct answer to this problem. The auditors will be concerned about all of these because all of these are necessary for the proper operation of an IT system and rather speaking of organization, internal controls. So even though the auditors may focus on specific controls in a certain area, they are going to be responsible for controls that are all responsibility areas. Well, that was a fun discussion. Hopefully everybody is a little bit more knowledgeable about internal controls today and nobody fell asleep, which I'm really personally proud of. All right. See you all on Friday.